So team, we've got an extremely exciting podcast today because we're going to be talking about the Challenger sale, which was a spectacular book from 10 years ago, originally published in 2011 by Matt Dixon and Brent Adamson when they were colleagues with CEB before Gardner bought CEB. The book was spectacular for a number of reasons that we're going to talk to, and it was so successful, by the way, it immediately led to another follow-on book called The Challenger Customer. But back in the day, it's hard to believe now because some of these concepts are so mainstay. But back in the day, some of these concepts were new and a little bit, let's call them confrontational in some ways for some salespeople out there. So a couple of things that were kind of interesting. First of all, what Matt and Brent did with the Challenger sale, let's start here. They started a book based on research. We know research in professional sales is generally light and fluffy at times. So the interesting thing about the Challenger sale team is that they came at it from a point of research, and neither one of them had a deep background in professional selling at that point in time. The second thing, which was spectacular, they found that even though they were writing this soon after one of the worst business crises many of us had lived through, 2008, the financial crisis, kind of seems ironic now given what we're going through today. But what they found was some salespeople were still being enormously successful with their businesses. Most sales organizations were having a tough time, but there were bright spots. And they ended up identifying kind of categories of salespeople that were most successful. They called that category the Challenger. And there were other categories that we were all very familiar with, like the relationship builder, the hard worker, the lone wolf, the reactive problem solver. But at this time, Challenger, leading with insight, was a new thing 10 years ago. So I'm extremely excited to speak with Matt in today's podcast. Incredibly interesting guy. I'm sure you're going to enjoy the podcast as well. And if you do, please let us know. Follow the podcast and rate the podcast. Your feedback's really important to us. Hey, Matt, welcome to the show.
Mark, thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure.
And so as you may have heard in the introduction, Matt, a huge fan of the Challenger sale.
Thank you.
I think what's interesting today is many of the things that you and Brent spoke of in the book, they're mainstay today. But I suspect, because I was selling back in those days heavily then, I suspect you came across a little whitewater when you originally released the book.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the journey to release this book and some of the things you faced when you put it out into the public.
Yeah, no, great question. It is funny. It is hard to believe, actually. It makes me feel really old that it's not 10 years old. But it is interesting that it continues to. It surprises me still to this day. There are people who come across it for the first time, and I think they find it quite relevant. Mark, you mentioned it in
absolutely
the environment, right? So it speaks to them now, even though it was written for a different time. I think what was interesting, if we think about the time frame. So you mentioned that Brent and I worked for a company called CEB, has since been acquired by Gardner, and we were both colleagues in the sales research practice. And so our job was really to provide research to a network of about 700 heads of sales, all business to business around the world. And the way we determined our agenda every year was to go out and ask those heads of sales, what are the big issues that you could use a dedicated research team to go and explore, bring data back, and unpack for you. How can we be a best assistance? And at the time in 2008, they were asking the question that you articulated, Mark, which was, and we all know it's a tough time to be selling, but there's this mystery going on in the sales organization, which is some of my sellers are still bringing in fantastic results that we would be happy to have in the best of times, and they're doing it in the worst of times. So what are they doing differently? And I think at the same time, there was this kind of growing frustration or sense that a lot of the training, a lot of the guidance and coaching they'd given their sales teams, the directions they pointed them in, weren't really producing the results maybe they once did 10, 20 years prior. And so they were starting to see there was some disturbance in the force. And then there was this event. And so we went out to study this. I think if I fast forward to a few years after the book came out, and this actually isn't in the book, but I think what Brent and I realized, and our team at CEB realizes this, and I think it's why it still speaks to people today. This was not a book actually about selling in a downturn. It turns out it was a book about selling to information empowered customers. And so we became well known for a data point that's not even in the book. It's actually in the second book you held up, The Challenger Customer, about how today's customer doesn't engage the salesperson until they're almost 60% through the purchase journey. That was another data point that earned us a lot of Rotten Tomatoes from folks out there. But it was something that when you shared that with sales leaders in their teams, they said, yeah, I see that all the time. What happens is the customer, there's so much information on our website. There's so much information that Gartner's putting out and Forrester's putting out and in G2 and on LinkedIn and all these places, white papers and webinars and factoids and infographics. And I can learn all about opportunities and what vendors do and how they compare and how they stack rank and even about what I should pay for a solution. I can create a short list on my own, and then I can start calling the vendors. And of course, for a salesperson, that puts them in a really awful position because gone is the opportunity to ask the customer, diagnose their needs, position your value proposition uniquely for the customer, show how you outperform your competitors, and kind of create that category of one that we all want to be in. That opportunity is come and gone. Now you're one of three, and the customer's thinking, I know you can all do the job. Now I just want to see who I can put the screws to around price. So when I present Challenger, I actually don't start with the 2008 story. I did back in 2008. Now I start with that phenomenon of customers learning on their own. But you asked a second question, which was about the early experience. And I think you're quite right. We definitely did get some flack early on. I think it was for a few reasons. One, you hit on in your intro, which is we're not sales guys. We never have been. I haven't done what you've done professionally. I'm a researcher by trade. So is Brent. And so our team at CEB. But what's so interesting is that the story resonated with serious heads of sales from really big organizations. And the reason, as I mentioned before, is they sensed something wasn't quite right. What they were telling their sellers to do wasn't generating the returns that it once did in the early days of solution selling. And things had started to fray. And what had happened, they didn't know this, but what happened is the customer had become much more information empowered and much more sophisticated in how they bought, but they didn't have anything new to tell their sellers to go do. I think the second thing is that these are serious minded leaders, right? And they are, and what's always bugged me, I'm sure it bugs you, it bugs folks like Neil Rackham, is the fact that there is a real dearth of serious research around sales. And I think the fact that we went out and we took a data-based perspective spoke to serious minded sales leaders around the world and smart and progressive sales people and managers who said, okay, these are people bringing the same kind of research that's done around marketing, around customer behavior, around finance, around innovation, strategy, and they're doing it for me. And I think, so that was interesting. We were not salespeople, we're data guys, research guys. And I think that spoke to people, but it also kind of offended people who had grown up selling and it also, I think, it created chop around this. You mentioned before, we'll talk about this more, but the distinction between the relationship builder and the challenger. There's a whole industry around relationship building. And, I think what's funny about this, and I think one of the ways it works, I remember a sales leader wrote the book for a big industrial company, Fortune 100 company, read the book. We went out to visit him. Brent and I both spent a couple of hours with him talking about the research. And he said as we gave him a copy of the book, and he said as we were escorting us out, walking us back to the lobby, he said, I got to tell you guys, I don't love the concept of challenge. Like, I don't like the word. And why
the name, the name, the brand, right? Of the challenger.
That created a lot of chop. The subtitle, Taking Control, it just didn't. It felt like it was rude and aggressive and pushy and obnoxious, and it sort of raised people's kind of hackles, if you will, right from the get-go. And he said, why did you have to call it that? Why didn't you just call it the new relationship builder? Because what you guys are really talking about is building a relationship founded on business insight. That's what you're talking about. It's a new kind of relationship. And I said, well, if we called it the new relationship builder, you wouldn't have read it. And he said, actually, that's a pretty good point. I wouldn't have. You would have
sold 10 copies instead of the gazillions of copies. You bring up such a great point, Matt, about the research. And I think that probably, far better than me. That's probably one of the reasons it resonated so much, because the timing of the release of the Challenger sale was very close to the timing of us starting in the funnel, where I'd been this sales leader and sales professional for 15 years and wanted to start to help other companies. So I had no other way of going about doing it except reading everything I could find. And that kind of trend has continued to this day. Just read everything I can find on professional sales, and there is a huge gap between books that come out where somebody says, here's what you should do, with no background, no insight, no research, and then research-based findings or concepts and stories. And I'll call out Daniel Pink, who's going to be a guest on the podcast in a couple of weeks.
One of my neighbors here in DC, and we actually, it's funny you mentioned that, because we spent time with Dan early on before the book came out, previewing some of the findings and getting his feedback, just because we just loved his approach and his counterintuitive way he approached problems, like what motivates, engages people, from his book Drive, for instance. And so we've always kind of knelt at the altar of Dan Pink, and I really enjoyed spending time with him.
Yeah, you go to something like To Sell Is Human, and the bibliography on To Sell Is Human could be the real content of an MBA course in professional sales.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that resonated so much. And you referenced Neil Rackham.
Yeah.
When he did his original research, you'd know better than me, but he was on about 35 or 40,000 sales calls. Yeah. Like, think of that, 40,000 or 35,000 sales calls. So when he came up with spin selling and sort of drove the third wave of selling, he tells a nice history of professional selling in your book. In the intro, it really gives some credibility to it. And I think even still today, there's this ongoing need for research, because with what's taken place with social media and this third, fourth, fifth generation of professional sales coming into the marketplace since this book was written, the internet platitudes and the ideas on LinkedIn, if we actually applied some of the things we see on LinkedIn in terms of advice of professional selling, I'd have to have a second or third job.
So you might want to have some backup options.
Yeah, we need, I'd be keeping my fingers crossed for that professional hockey career. So when one of the other things I always found interesting was, at the time, I remember, you tell me if it's correct, but we're really going to get into the meat of the book and why it's so relevant today. But there seemed to be almost this pushback about consensus buying and the number of buyers involved in the deal.
Yeah.
But my personal history had been doing very large sales for a long time. There had always been a large number of people influencing, very, $100 million transactions. Yeah. There was always teams of 10.
Yeah, for sure.
Everybody was scared to death.
Yeah.
To make the decisions to do those major outsourcing things. But I remember at the time, I looked at the research and, that you'd put together, it seemed very logical to me. But it seemed to me, you'll tell me if I'm right, there was a lot of pushback even about the consensus buying.
100%. Just really quickly, Mark, back to your point about Neil Rackham. The funny story is that the way we met Professor Rackham, who by the way, he is a psychologist by trade, right? He is a researcher as well. Mm-hmm. And he told us that he was familiar with what was called then the Sales Executive Council, which was one of the programs that I ran at CEB and Brent and I worked in.
Right.
And he said, you guys put out good research, but we'd never actually spoken to the man. And it wasn't until we caught wind that he was interested in this Challenger research way before the book came out. It was a slide deck that was just circulating from one of our presentations to our clients. Oh. And we saw a YouTube video of him presenting one of our graphics to his clients in Australia. And we said, wow, this is what an honor to have Professor Rackham talking about your stuff. We reached out to him. He invited us to Leesburg, Virginia, which is not too far from where we were in Arlington, and invited us out for the day. And he told us, he said, and he pointed to his bookshelf and he said, I get a manuscript or a galley copy of every single sales book that comes out, and every single one is accompanied by a request to write the forward or give a blurb or something like that. And he said, some of them I do, most of them I don't. He said, I probably turned down like 95% of the requests, but we're talking like a wall-to-wall shelf of sales books. Yeah. And he said, the first thing I do before I decide whether I'm going to endorse it, and whether actually I'm even going to read it, is I flip through it. And if I don't see any bar charts and I don't see any graphs and I don't see any research, then it goes right back on the shelf and I issue a polite decline. Now, just because it has bar charts doesn't mean they're good. So then I give it a little bit of a read and I see how rigorous, it's just sort of descriptive data. It's not serious quantitative analysis. It might go back on the shelf. I might give a blurb, but I'm not going to write it forward. He said, your stuff I found really interesting. And he said, I want to hear more about the research. And he then ran us through the ringer. We brought our head of research with us and he asked some pretty hard questions. And at the end of it, he said, I'm satisfied. After about 100 questions about how we did the analysis, the size of the data, the balance of the sample, how we validated the findings, and he said, "I'll, if you would like, I'll write your forward." And it was, we almost fell off our chairs. It was, just fantastic. I remember that as if it were yesterday. But you mentioned the consensus buying, just one of the other things. I would say, there were two sorts of pushback we got about Challenger. I think the first was these guys have never sold. It's like trying to teach somebody to fly an airplane. They've never been a pilot, right? So
Yeah.
we got some of that. We got some of people were offended by the title and the name, and it just came across. And to me, those were always people who hadn't taken the time to really understand what we're talking about. I always jokingly say, if you're rude and aggressive and obnoxious, you're the sixth profile, the jerk. We're not talking about that person. Challengers are professional,
Right.
pathetic, they're respectful, but they do hold their ground and they do push the customer's thinking. Now,
Yeah.
so there were those types of sources of pushback. And then there were folks who, of course, whose businesses were built on relationship building and needs diagnosis, and we were kind of saying that approach may
Yeah.
have worked in the past. It doesn't really work with an information empowered, sophisticated buyer. And so people were saying, "Hey, you're calling my baby ugly. You're saying what I teach people doesn't work as well." Then there was a different source of pushback. I mean, this was the more, I would call, thoughtful category. And the most common, the two pieces of feedback we got were, one, what does this mean for sales managers? So do you see a similar typology of managers? And because there's a chapter in Challenger, which I think people quite like. It's about the importance of coaching and
Yes.
innovation at the goal line and things like that. But it didn't talk about the typology of sales managers. The second thing was, like, so for instance, does my sales manager have to be a challenger? And it didn't really address that question. The second one was what you mentioned, which is, guys, this is interesting. It makes sense. It's based on data. I get it. But it's kind of a simplified view of complex sales. Let's be honest. The first step in the sale is to have that insight-based challenger conversation and get that one individual excited. But that you're a long way from the finish line, because you've got to get all their colleagues excited. You've got to manage that buying committee. Do you even know if you engage the right person up front? That actually led to all the work around the mobilizer, which then became the challenger customer. And we wrote a second book about that, really to answer the questions that came out of the first book. And as Brent has often said, I'll steal this shamelessly, which is, we find a lot of answers when we do research. We actually uncover a lot of questions that are unanswered. So it's sort of a never-ending journey. So.
Well, and I think you guys were so respectful to some of the good sales books and
For sure.
and
There are a lot of
methodologies, that had come up prior to you. So lots of respect for Neil Rackham and the original book for our listeners was Spin Selling. So spin selling and asking great questions. Another one I think that the Challenger touches on a lot was, I always thought that Miller-Hyman strategic selling was foundational. Mm-hmm. So for those going initially into, Neil Rackham's that third wave, complex selling in the 80s and 90s, in the early days, you were trying to figure out, okay, there are going to be multiple people involved. I think where your book took it to the next level is strategic selling tried to package people into certain categories, certain roles, when IT had such a lot of dominance, actually, in terms of major systems integrations projects, outsourcing projects. Technology kind of drove the bus.
Yeah.
It's very interesting today that isn't the case. Now it's gone the other way again, where business is driving technology decisions.
Yeah.
In our view, anyway. So technology is still at the table, but
I agree. And you know what I would say, Mark, I think it's so interesting because it's probably a simplified view of history, but I think what happened is you had somebody like Neil Rackham who did the research and said, effectively, complex sales are different from simple sales. It's kind of the point of the book. And then sort of laid out a set of behaviors that best complex sellers exhibit. And that gave birth to an entire run of a lot of fantastic work. Now it's simplified because some of this work actually came out before Neil Rackham's work. You think about like Matt Hannon's work and Mike Bosworth and these folks, but a lot of really smart thinkers who kind of, joined up with this movement around complex sales and started adding to the canon of thought, which gave birth to this entire solution selling kind of, rubric of work, or this, which is enormous. You could fill a library with everything that's been written about complex selling, and some fantastic work out there. I think we're at the very early stages of, and while it's 10 years old, Challenger, I think, was part of this insight selling movement, which is,
Yes.
it's not, we always talk about in research the lead steer effect, which is, Professor Rackham went out and understood those who sell successfully complex solutions do different things for those who sell successfully transactional products. But what was interesting is he looked at those lead steers and how they kind of shifted what they do and sort of pattern recognize and use data to tell a story and kind of codify that set of behaviors. And we tried to do the same thing. We said, look, the customers change the way they engage suppliers. Procurement is far more sophisticated. There's tons of information. The customer left to their own devices will box you out and force you to compete on price and see no difference between you and your other two competitors on the short list. Mm-hmm. So what are the lead steers doing? And we're always careful to point out, we didn't invent Challenger. We just went out and studied what the best had already figured out and gave some language to it and told a story around it. And I think that's continuing to this day. But that I think we're at the very beginning of that idea of how do we engage the information empowered sophisticated buyer. And now since we've done the Challenger sale, there's been a whole series of books. Mike Shells and John. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on John's last name. It was embarrassing. You can cut that out of the podcast. So the guys, Mike Schultz and his team from Rain Group have written a book on insight selling, which I thought was really good, another database perspective. And they took some of our ideas and then they said, well, we think they got this right, but we think it might be a little bit different in this respect. And so they add to the body of work. And I'm hoping 10 years from now, people are still doing that, or maybe there's yet a new wave, something different has happened on the customer side that we all now need to, it starts a new era in sales. And I think that was part of what Neil was so excited about, was he was part of that early movement around solution selling, but he also noticed things have changed. And what we taught people back in the 70s and 80s is not working quite as well today. But it's not because it's not because it's bad guidance, it's because the customers change how they buy. And yet nobody had really written or done research on how that affects the salesperson.
I think that how interesting, look back, you talked about, hey, maybe this is relationship, 2.0 was really leading with insight. But I think the other thing was, it was the earliest days of identifying that significant change in the buyer's journey.
Yeah.
Your old stomping ground now, Gardner, CB to Gardner. You've seen the spaghetti diagram that people call they've released, and Frank Sapides from Harvard worked on that with others. Mm-hmm. But what we're really trying to do is respond to how people buy. We were always trying to respond to how people buy. Mm-hmm. But I think there was a certain period of time there, long before you or I, where the way to help somebody buy was to be a talking brochure, because they didn't have access to anything.
That's right. There was no internet, right? So,
no internet. So then now they've got access. Now they're more informed, but not better informed. Yeah. Same problem we all, if you have a nosebleed tomorrow morning, you're going to go on WebMD and start searching Google. Yeah. And my doctor gets tired of me reaching out saying, hey, I think I've got something serious because I have more information about health issues, but he's saying, listen, stop searching the internet. Just call me the next time something's wrong. Yeah,
that's right.
You're wasting my time and you're worrying yourself. So there's more information, but we're not better informed. And I think that's where this continuing to push with this insight. Mm-hmm. And because we're sales trainers, Matt, one of the things that we were constantly perplexed by is two things, I think. First of all, as logical as all of these ideas are, they're not commonplace.
Yeah. 100%. You're absolutely right.
And it's shocking to me across sophisticated businesses, professional services industries, law, accounting, consulting, smart professionals have no idea what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Technology companies that like to think that they're on the cutting edge of professional sales because they're leveraging a lot of demand generation technology, the sales stack, Tony Hughes and others have helped there. But when they actually get into a live conversation, it's a disaster because they're actually pitching the same way we used to pitch, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Or they have this belief that they can magically persuade or cajole somebody, with fancy gimmickry. Yeah. And it's just one, I guess my question, you've seen so many folks, you've trained and coached so many, you've seen this. Why isn't this sticking? Why isn't this whole discipline of professional sales getting these fundamentals? What's the problem today?
Yeah, it's a great question. If I had the answer to that question, I think we'd live in
Yeah,
a much
sorry,
bigger house.
that's why I run the podcast. I'm trying to get the answer to that question so I can become rich.
Yeah, no, look, it's this 64,000 Canadian and
64
American dollar
million.
net together question. I think so. Look, it's such a fascinating question, and I would say I encountered this a little bit with Challenger actually, and some of the pushback we get from clients. We bring the idea, and of course, CEB created a business which Gartner then sold. It's called Challenger Inc., and they are the global provider of Challenger development programs and messaging. I'll talk a little bit about I think what they see, and those guys do this every day globally and do great work. And they see, I think, part of the explanation for or answer to your question, at least as they shared with me. But I will say in general, I think I hear from a lot of companies, look, this is really interesting, this idea of selling with insight and Challenger, but I can't even get my folks to be good solution sellers. In fact, they don't even understand our product. I wish they were talking brochures. They can't even do that, you know? And so while there's appetite and there's understanding that we need to be here, people are still kind of back here. And so we would occasionally run into companies that said, you know, this feels very 301 for us. We need the 201 or even the 101, honestly.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's unfortunate because the customer's not staying put and they're continuing to evolve the way they engage suppliers and vendors. And so those who keep pace and follow that lead steer effect and learn, and as you talked about, who read and consume the research and understand the implications and continuously evolve their sales approach and their marketing approach will benefit from that. And those who don't are going to get whipsawed by it. And I think you see it all the time. And unfortunately for a lot of heads of sales, that realization comes too late. And so the next head of sales who comes in and realizes they need to shake things up. As far as why these things don't grab hold, I can speak at least for Challenger. I would say there are two reasons that companies get insight selling wrong. And we could talk about why they might get solution selling wrong and needs diagnosis, because we all know there's a trail of tears around like failed solution selling. You know, and I have a point of view there, though I'm not an expert on that. What I would say is around insight selling, I think there are two big failure paths. The first one is insight selling. Challenger is so many sales organizations approach it merely as an individual skill.
Right.
I've got to hire and develop people to be challengers or to be able to challenge in a customer conversation. Mm-hmm. But what they don't understand is that being a good challenger requires not just individual skill, but organizational capability. And specifically, it requires the company to build those insights. It's not fair and not reasonable to expect an individual salesperson to come up with those insights on their own. And in fact, you'll probably be so your best sellers can do it. They're probably already doing it without knowing it or calling it that. But the average seller is going to struggle with that. And what it requires is the commitment of sales leadership, but more specifically marketing, actually, and product to come together and answer the questions. You know, why should the customer buy our solution instead of our competitors? Mm-hmm. And it's not because we're more innovative. It's not because we're more entrepreneurial or we're more customer centric. It's got to be a capability we deliver, a way we deliver it that is fundamentally unique. Then the second question is, what would have to be true for the customer to want to pay us and ideally pay us a premium for that unique benefit? That is really hard work that leadership needs to take on. Now they can take those ideas and they want to pressure test them with sales. And we think it's this, go out and try that. And so sales is very much the lab to go test those ideas and those messages, but the company has got to build those. And what we've always said is, look, if you tell your salespeople to go out and challenge customer thinking and you give them nothing insightful with which to challenge, they're merely annoying, they're not challenging. And so, you know, that I think is failure path number one. That failure path number two is right behind you on your wall marker, which is sales coaching. The reality is, I think, especially as we get into more sophisticated things, you know, we're not talking about product selling, we're talking about solution selling and needs diagnosis. We're talking about consensus buying. We're talking about bringing insight and having that kind of building constructive tension and using insight to change the way the customer thinks, break their mental model. Those are not things that you can learn in a one-day sales training seminar.
Right.
You can get exposed to those ideas that way, but you will only get comfortable with those things through creating zones of safe practice, working with a sales manager who understands the difference between spreadsheet coaching and behavioral coaching, and is committed to you, committed to your development and getting good at this stuff. And
Yeah.
that those are two reasons that you see it sometimes not work out. Is companies don't invest in the insight creation, they don't understand the company's role, and secondly, they don't help their sales managers understand their role around coaching to those behaviors. And I think the coaching piece is probably also true around solution selling, is my sense, at least based on our earlier research. That's our sense as well, is that coaching has long been unfortunately overlooked in a critical capability of a great sales organization.
So true, Matt. And our experience when we're consulting with clients or when we're training sales leaders or sales teams, I think two things have kind of happened today. I think that job of the sales leader, as you aptly point out, and I'm going to forget where I saw the research, but it was Gardner or others. The tenure of a sales leader right now is insanely short.
Sure, that's very short. The half-life is not long.
It's not a stable role, and you start to look at the stakeholders they have to address. We always bring this up. They've got to work with clients.
Yep.
So all encompassing when they're in front of clients, they've got to work with their executive teams or the boards. And they've got a unique role in that their performance evaluation is public domain, and they're the only one around the executive table whose performance is actually on the scoreboard.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody knows the number. Is Mark doing well? Is he not doing well? And then third, we've got to actually be working with the sales team themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so the recent Gardner research that we took a look at said, because of this insane quarterly pressure for performance, sales leaders fundamentally do two things. They actually close deals in the pipe. So they do a lot of coaching on opportunity management so that we can close the deals that are at the bottom of the funnel to make sure we hit our numbers.
Yeah.
And then we try and act as an advocate for our sales organization internally.
Yeah.
Both of those things have short-term gains, but it means I'm not spending time coaching. I'm not spending time recruiting, all those other things. And we believe actually in the funnel that it's that coaching that doesn't get done. And that's really the X factor of sales management today.
Yeah.
If they could do it. And what I really liked about the Challenger sale was you do have the couple of chapters at the end talking about sales leadership and reminding people of just the fundamentals. You know, there's a difference between inspection and coaching.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And guess what? If I'm in a coaching event, I know it's a coaching event and my rep knows it's a coaching event.
Yeah.
So there's some great stuff there. Hey, let's take this toward what you're seeing in the future.
Sure.
So given everything you do, and we're going to take on, I know you're into a new adventure, reasonably new adventure. But before that, where do you see sales going in the future? In the past, you'd been doing surveys and assessments and all that. And today, some of the technologies got to be helpful for that with AI and all of those things. We can get some real-time insights in terms of what our sales teams are doing with lots of tools out there today.
Yeah, great. No, it's a great question. It's a great setup in terms of what we're doing next. So we actually have a new book coming out in the fall of 2022. So it's called The Jolt Effect: How High Performers Overcome Customer Indecision. So let me tell you the story about this book, which is, it's funny, we're talking about Professor Rackham, and you're right. You're talking about smiling when you're talking about the 35,000 sales calls, 12 years to complete, a couple of dozen researchers on his team. It cost in early 80s dollars, I guess, when they did the research, or late 70s dollars, like $1 million. Today is about $2.5 to $3 million to complete that work. And the preface of the new book starts with that story, which is that was always, at least for serious students of sales, that was the gold standard of sales research. And it would never occur to anybody to ever try to repeat it, let alone exceed it, because the cost and the expense and the time of flying all over the world is sitting in on 35. Like, nobody's going to I worked for a global research company, CV, which got acquired by an even bigger research company, Gardner, would never pay for anything like that. No way, especially when you don't know what's going to come out of it.
Right.
And then something funny happened not funny, but something serious and unexpected happened in March of 2020, which is sales went virtual overnight.
Right.
And for a sales researcher, what that allowed us to do was study, because the problem with studying sales was that the only way to study sales in its entirety and really understand what happens in those critical meetings is to do what Professor Rackham did. But that's not true when 100% of sales are happening on Zoom and WebEx and Microsoft Teams and you name it. And so we started in around the spring summer of 2020. We actually called it big tongue in cheek. We called it the Sales Vaccine Project, because our view was if scientists can figure out the vaccine, if they can figure out how to solve this pandemic through medicine science, stuff that used to take 10, 20 years, and they're going to do it in a year, then surely we can find out some groundbreaking insight about sales and do it in the same amount of time using modern technology.
Wow.
And so we collected 2.5 million sales calls, and we used machine learning to study those interactions. And what we found was absolutely fascinating. The big thing we found, a lot of the things I think we found was validating stuff we already knew about the sale and about what great salespeople do. They lead with insight, they build constructive tension, all those things that we talked about. They are great at managing consensus, all these things we talked about in the other books. But we found something very unexpected, which is that high-performing salespeople think of sales as not a one-act play, but a two-act play. Act one is about generating customer intent. And the way that you do that is that you've got to defeat the customer status quo. This has always been what we talk about in sales training. Every sales book, including the Challenger sale, spin selling, Challenger customer, are all about that. How do I get the customer to say yes to our solution? Doing that requires breaking the gravitational pull of the status quo, as we know is quite powerful in the customer's mind for a variety of psychological reasons. But it still leads, in many cases, a surprisingly high percentage of cases, leads to the customer, despite saying they want to buy from us, nevertheless doing nothing. Right. And so the percentage of deals lost to no decision is huge and increasing. And so when we ran our research, we did a separate study. We found that the percentage of deals in business to business was nearly 40% of customers who said they would buy, that you won, Mark, we are going to go within the funnel, we are going to go with your solution, and nevertheless, never send back the DocuSign, never execute the agreement. Wow. We also found, by the way, we collected a whole bunch of consumer calls. So there's a consumer selling, especially in light of the decline in footfall traffic or foot traffic in stores with the pandemic, selling insurance, wireless to small business, but also to consumers, wealth management advice, cards, you name it, travel and leisure happens through inbound sales, which is a great petri dish to study what the best salespeople do. And in that environment, it's even higher. It's like 65% of customers who call in and quite literally will say, I want to place an order, get off the call without ever having done so. Wow. And so something funny is happening. What it told us was, I mean, here's the wrinkle we found in the research. What most salespeople do, I think, in that situation where they have earned the customer's stated intent to buy, they have said, you have won, you've convinced the buying committee, you've convinced us, we want to go with you, we want to work together. And when they start to get cold feet and they start to waver and they start to go radio silent, what the average salesperson assumes is the reason that's happening is that the customer doesn't get their value proposition. They don't really understand how bad things are for them right now. And so they go back and they actually do what we taught them to do in the Challenger. They go back to try to reconvince the customer that the pain of same is worse than the pain of change, right? You've got to move away from the status quo, create that burning platform. Or maybe you missed how differentiated our feeds and speeds and features and benefits were. So we're going to try to hit you again with our sales messaging or do another demo. Maybe we didn't get the buying committee on board. But what we find is that those attempts to go back and, if you will, relitigate the status quo with an indecisive customer actually make things worse, not better. In fact, we found those attempts drive negative returns in sales outcome 84% of the time. So this is with a customer who's already said, I'm convinced, I'm moving away from the status quo, I want to go with you. And when they start not to do it, if we go back and try to reconvince them, we actually make things worse, not better. We're actually better off doing nothing than trying to reconvince them. What we found high performers realize is that there's a second act to the sale that is fundamentally different from the first act. The first act about generating intent is about beating the status quo. Bodies and bodies of research, including our previous books, all about that. The second act of the play is about overcoming customer indecision. And the playbooks for those two things are not the same. In fact, if you run the playbook for overcoming the status quo with an indecisive customer, it actually makes things worse, not better. And we found there's a very unique playbook that high performers use to try to overcome the customer's natural hesitancy. That hesitancy, based on about 40 years, which, by the way, I wouldn't wish this on anybody. We read about 40 years of social science and behavioral economics, human psychology research to try to explain why do people become indecisive. And it turns out there are three reasons. The first reason is they feel like they've not done enough research. And so we see this all the time in sales, right? Think about that customer where they've said, yeah, I want to buy from you. But then somebody in the buying committee says, oh, I just heard of this new startup that does something similar.
Exactly.
And they say, well, we want to go talk, we're going to buy from you. We want to talk to these guys first. Or,
yep.
or you know what? The Magic Quadrant just came out. We want to make sure we read that and we talk to the analysts first and whatever. They feel a lack of information. That's the first psychological reason people don't move forward, is because of a lack of information. The second is what we call valuation problems. Valuation problems are, I am convinced that I want to buy your solution, but I actually don't know what configuration of that solution. And let's be honest, in technology sales today, as with many other fields, yeah, exactly. And so you end up with 100 different possible ways. There are contract length, there's professional services or DIY, there's the light version, the premium, the gold, the platinum, you name it. All kinds of ways to buy this. And customers just stare at this feature set and these different options, and they're deeply worried. They don't know how to compare them or how to project value in the future, and they're worried that they're going to pick the wrong thing.
Paradox of choice.
That's right. That's exactly right. In fact, we in the chapter in the book around this, we talk about Barry Schwartz's work around the paradox of choice and how choice, it's great for attracting people to have conversations with you, but at some point, it actually becomes overwhelming. And so the last source of indecision is what we call outcome uncertainty. Outcome uncertainty, we don't call it that, psychologists call it that. Outcome uncertainty is my fear that despite what you've told me, despite your powerful ROI projections, despite all of your reference clients telling us how wonderful you are, despite the Magic Quadrant putting you in the upper right, despite all those wonderful reviews that we've read, we are going to be the one company that's not going to get those returns, and it's going to be my name on that contract, and my head's going to roll when it happens. Yeah. And so, you know, at the end of the day, people don't get fired for maintaining the status quo because it's happened for, it's been happening forever, but people do get fired for changing it and making a wrong decision around how to do so. And so we found that there's a set of behaviors. JOLT is an acronym. It refers to 4 high performer behaviors. Justify your time spend. Justify your time spend is about validating, or if you will, qualifying opportunities, not just on the things we can see, like industry, growth rate, existence of legacy systems that may or may not integrate with our solution, but also the things you can't see. So disqualifying opportunities based on the customer's ability to make decisions. So looking for signs of decision-making dysfunction, which are quite human, and we provide a whole roadmap on the 4 things within that high performers look for. The O, back to your paradox of choice. O is about offering a firm recommendation. It's all well and good to talk about all the things you can do, and that's actually feels really good to the customer early on to know there's eminent configurability of your solution. But at some point, you've got to tell them, and you've got to make a deeply personal and firm recommendation. If I were you, I would go with this. And it's even more important that the recommendation you make is not the premium, but rather, you know what? I don't think you guys should buy that. I want to be a good steward of your budget. I think you should go here. The L in JOLT is limiting the exploration. So we've got to shut off the blind alleys, because left to their own devices, the customer will consume content and research till the cows come home. And we've got to, at some point, tell them, we are the expert, trust us. We've got to establish that credibility as experts, but we've also got to overcome the agency dilemma, because deep down, they don't trust us. And we've got to give them those confidence givers. So they say, you know what, Mark, you know more about this than I do. I'm going to put myself in your hands. And the T is taking risk off the table. To get that customer to commit, we've got to provide a safety net that makes them feel like they're not taking a blind leap of faith. We've got to overcome that outcome uncertainty. So JOLT is an acronym, which we like, but it also speaks to what's happening, right? We're jolting the customer out of their indecision. And the way we did it, I'm fascinated by this, because I'm a geek, as you can tell, and I love.
Absolutely not. But certainly passionate about this for sure, as is everybody, Matt, who's listening to this podcast.
Yeah, and you know what's been so interesting to me is exactly what you said before, and I've been waiting for the moment when we could get away, because Challenger and the other books we did interviews, we did quite a number of surveys. They have all sorts of data collection and methodological problems to them, and it's really labor intensive. And we're certainly not going to do what Professor Rackham did, because I could never get anybody to foot the bill for that, as much as I would love to do it.
Right.
But modern technology, natural language processing, big data analytics, call recording platforms, the gongs, the choruses, the Zooms, the Teams, suddenly create this moment where we can study this stuff in a way we've never been able to before. And what we found was totally unexpected. It was like when they just shot that telescope out into space, and imagine the things we're going to discover because we now have the technology to look much deeper and farther than we ever could before.
Well, when's the book coming out, by the way, Matt?
September 2022. So it's a little bit of a ways off, but we got a little bit of editing to do, getting ready for the launch. We're going to start really talking about it. This podcast will be one of the first times we talk about it, actually, Mark. So, but coming into the spring, we'll start, getting people excited about it and sprinkling out some early findings. And we do think it's going to be that. If I reflect back on the things we've studied, it's all about these changes in customer buying behavior. Challengers we talked about was, what do we do about the customer learning on their own and boxing us out and making a lot of assumptions about what they need and what we can do for them? How do we win in that world? The second, the consensus buying, which, as you said, for companies who've been selling complex solutions, has always been the case. But for companies who are going into that world, they're starting to experience this. And because of the customer's risk aversion, and as you said before, solutions once purchased by IT are now purchased by the business. IT is at the table, but now it's cats, dogs, and bicycles in that buy. How do we manage that dynamic? And I think the third problem is what happens when we are not one of three, but we're one of one. We've won the customer's business as they've stated it, but we still lose to no decision. How do we overcome that part of the journey? And what we're going to find is there's another problem we haven't solved, and we'll do that later. So
I'll tell you what, though, boy, that no decision is absolutely resonating. You've seen the research, certainly, I'm sure, better than me. But the research on the no decision, where it's creeping up and up and up, you're certainly speaking to a key issue in professional sales, which I think ties to two things: something happening on the customer end with the jolt. But it's also something happening on the sales end, which is we're not executing well enough. It isn't compelling. We're not covering everybody who can influence it. We're letting them go to no decision, or letting them have, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, because we haven't actually gone through our process properly.
Absolutely, and we make matters where you're spot on, Mark. In fact, we talk about FUD and fear and uncertainty. Now, what happens is so many sellers, they go back and they dial up the fear, uncertainty, and doubt in order to get the customer to move forward, but they actually make it worse because the customer is no longer worried about or concerned about that I'm going to win with your solution. They're already convinced of that. Now they're worried about not losing by buying your solution. And those two things are very different. So
very different. Hey, Matt, I can't believe it, but we're out of time. So tell us a little bit about what you're up to now, how we get in touch with you before Jolt comes out. If someone's got more interest in what you're up to.
So I've just it's very exciting. And again, your audience will be one of the first to hear about this. I've just left a wonderful company, Tether, where I worked. Is how I learned this whole big data analytics and conversation intelligence and NLP and all this stuff, which was a wonderful experience. But I'm going out on my own with two of my former CB colleagues, Ted McKenna and Rory Channer. We've launched a company called DCM Insights. DCM Insights, we call it the Customer Understanding Lab, and it's about growth through science. And so we are a research organization studying these changes in customer buying behavior, and more to the point, studying what are best salespeople, partners in law firms, what are best marketing firms, service organizations doing to respond to that ever-evolving landscape on the customer side, and how can we track that lead steer effect? And then we deliver our findings through assessments, diagnostics, development experiences, in advisory support, as well as speaking and workshops and the whole 9 yards. So check us out at dcminsights.com, and that's got my contact details. And I tell you, anybody who's listening to the podcast, who's listening to this conversation, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and let me know you heard me on the show, and you'd like to stay in touch. Maybe you have a question about Challenger or the new book. Happy to talk to you about it.
Well, hey, Matt, the whole purpose of these podcasts is to, help sales leaders, professionals, CEOs continue their lifelong learning in this amazingly challenging business discipline. And I have a hard time believing anybody who was listening to you today didn't pick up lots of things they can learn from. I'll be the first on the list to read the Jolt Effect, the
Thanks,
Jolt Effect. And thank you so much for joining us today, Matt. Just a
Thank
pleasure
you so
meeting
much.
you.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, Mark. Bye-bye.